On that crisp autumn morning in Charleston, South Carolina, the wind seemed to whisper that something different was about to happen. The sky was overcast, the kind of weather that makes people crave a warm, cozy cup of coffee. In the heart of the city, Eleanor's place was bustling with activity. It was a refined establishment, known for its sophisticated dishes and elegant clientele. No one there expected that, on that day, a boy in torn shoes would change everything. He entered slowly, pushing open the glass door with both small, grimy hands. His hair was messy, his shirt was dirty, and he had a look that mixed hunger and hope. People's eyes turned immediately, some in shock, others in obvious disgust. The nearest waiter froze for a second before approaching. Silence fell over the room as if time had stopped. Before I continue, I want to say that I ask God to bless you with all His infinite love, giving you much health, peace, joy, and faith, for we can never lose faith in God, for He will never abandon us, for His love is eternal and infinite. I also take this opportunity to ask that you like the video and subscribe to the channel. This helps me a lot, thank you. Are you lost, boy? The waiter asked quietly, trying not to attract even more attention. The boy simply shook his head and pointed to the counter. He wanted food. A simple gesture that said it all. But here, where the dishes cost more than the rent of many houses, that was unacceptable. A woman in a blue dress, sitting near the window, looked on with disdain and whispered to her husband, "This is absurd. There should be security in this place." The mood changed. The laughter and chatter subsided. One of the managers, noticing the general discomfort, walked over to the boy with firm steps. And that's when everything started to go wrong. The manager, a blond man in an impeccable suit, bent down and spoke firmly. "Look, kid, this is no place to play. Go away now." The boy tried to say something, but his voice wouldn't come out. He just stared at the empty plate on the counter, as if silently pleading. The response was cruel. The manager grabbed him by the arm and pushed him toward the door. The sound of the door closing behind him was louder than any scream. The boy stood there on the sidewalk, his eyes watering, as the cold seemed to penetrate his bones. Inside the restaurant, no one said anything. Some went back to eating as if nothing had happened. Others simply looked away, uncomfortable. But there was something strange in the air. A silent energy, as if the universe itself were preparing a counterattack. The boy took one last look out the window, then turned to leave. It was then that the door opened again, but not for him. An elderly woman entered with firm steps and a determined gaze. She wore a grey wool coat and an antique brooch on her chest. Her white hair was tied back in an elegant bun. The maitre d' hurried to greet her with a servile smile. "Madame Eleanor, what an honor to have you with us today," he said, trying to hide his nervousness. Her name carried weight, respect, and power. She didn't answer right away. Her eyes were fixed on the window. More precisely, on the boy who was now crossing the street with slow steps. "What happened here?" she asked, her voice firm but calm. Silence fell like a heavy curtain. No one wanted to be the first to answer. The manager approached, trying to maintain his composure. "Just a street urchin, ma'am. He came in here dirty, scaring the customers. I did what was necessary." Mrs. Eleanor frowned. "Scaring the customers, or reminding them of something they'd rather forget," she said, her tone almost prophetic. Outside, the boy stopped and looked back, as if sensing something was shifting. Mrs. Eleanor came out the door and walked over to him. The scene made everyone inside the restaurant stand up and look. She knelt in front of the boy and held his small, dust-covered hands. And that's when something began to emerge. She watched him for a few seconds, in absolute silence. "What's your name, dear?" she asked, with a tenderness that contrasted with the elitist atmosphere around her. "Peter," he answered with difficulty. And then, for a moment, her face paled. Her eyes filled with an emotion that was difficult to hide. She turned to the restaurant, with the boy at her side, and said loudly, "Does anyone here know who this boy is?" The room fell silent once more. No response. "Well then, sit down, because I'm going to tell you." With that sentence, the mystery was revealed, and the doors of truth began to open. Some customers tried to get up and leave, but she held up her hand. "I suggest you stay. There are lessons here that no amount of money can buy." The employees stopped everything they were doing. No one dared interrupt the woman. The boy looked at everyone, still not understanding the reason for the change. Meanwhile, the manager was sweating. He'd known Mrs. Eleanor for decades and knew she didn't make a fuss for nothing. If she was talking like that, it was because there was much more to the story. And deep down, he feared it was something that would implicate him personally. And he was right to fear. The woman looked at the manager with piercing eyes. "This boy didn't show up here by chance," she said, as if she already knew exactly what she was about to reveal. And at that moment, even the cutlery stopped clinking. There was a heaviness in the air. Something about to explode with emotion. "I know this boy," she continued, her voice breaking. "Because he carries the same blood that saved my son, many years ago." People looked at each other, confused. What do you mean? What did she mean by that? And most surprisingly, the restaurant owner himself wasn't there at that moment. "Yes, the boy who was kicked out of this place is the grandson of the man who saved my son's life when he was just 5 years old." The revelation fell like a bombshell. Murmurs spread like wildfire. And the manager paled. He knew exactly what she was talking about. His name was Thomas. A humble gardener. "He saved my son from a fire. And he died that day." Her eyes were moist now. "And no one ever knew he left behind a young son, and a grandson who now lives on the streets." Tears streamed silently down Mrs. Eleanor's face. "And what did you do?" she asked loudly, staring at the customers. "You turned your faces away. You refused a plate of food. You ignored the pain of someone who carries within them the same nobility you claim to have." The silence was absolute. Everyone knew there were no excuses. The boy, Peter, just held her hand, not fully grasping the scale of it all. But he felt something new. Something called dignity. For the first time in a long time, someone was fighting for him. And that was something no meal could buy. Inside the restaurant, tension was rising. Some customers began to lower their heads in shame. Others murmured, trying to justify their actions. But no one could look away from the scene. Because in that moment, everyone was confronted with something greater than comfort, the truth. Mrs. Eleanor then stood up, her hands still clasped in Peter's, and said, "This restaurant bears my name. But today, I'm ashamed of it." The shock was general. She took a deep breath and added, "And that is just the beginning of what I have to say." Behind the polished wooden counter, where the waiters arranged silverware with almost military precision, the silence became heavy. No one said a word, but glances met, filled with discomfort and guilt. One of the young assistants, named Ryan, stopped polishing a glass and stared at the glass door as if expecting someone to return. His expression was one of someone who had seen more than he should. Perhaps he knew something. In the kitchen, the team leader, Meredith, had her hand over the pan, but she wasn't moving. The food was already burning. She'd heard every word Mrs. Eleanor said. Her eyes were fixed on the clock on the wall, as if its hand might turn back and undo what had been said. She knew Thomas's story. She just didn't know he'd left behind a grandson. Meanwhile, the manager, Brad, stood motionless, his hands cold and his heart racing. Deep down, he knew what he'd done to that boy was unforgivable, not for the act itself, but for the symbolism. In that expulsion, he hadn't seen a human being. He'd seen an inconvenience. And that, now, felt like a crime. In the pantry, an older employee named Susan clutched the crucifix she always wore around her neck. She'd been there for 15 years. She'd served Eleanor herself many times. She knew that when the woman spoke that way, it was because something very deep had been touched. And for the first time, Susan felt ashamed to be a part of this place. The younger waiters, trained to always smile, now looked down at their shoes. Some even had compassion in their eyes when Peter entered. But no one dared intervene. And now, as Mrs. Eleanor walked the boy back into the restaurant, a harsh truth lingered in the air. Silence is also a form of omission. She paused in the doorway and looked around. Each of you had a choice today. Some chose to ignore. Others chose to judge. But none of you chose to love. The sentence fell like a stone onto the fine marble. No one moved. Even the clocks seemed to have stopped. The boy entered slowly, still holding her hand. His eyes roamed the room, where he had once been rejected. Now he was there by right. Not by status, not by wealth, but by history. A history no one knew, or pretended not to know. And that hurt more than the cold outside. Mrs. Eleanor turned to the staff. I want to hear from you now. What do you have to say? One by one, everyone remained silent. Until Ryan, the young assistant, stepped forward. He was trembling. But there was something in his eyes, regret. And also courage. Ma'am, I saw him come in. And I thought he just needed help. But I was afraid I'd lose my job. His voice broke. I'm sorry. Eleanor just nodded. You were sincere. And that's more than many have the courage to be these days. Brad, the manager, cleared his throat. He was visibly uncomfortable. I just wanted to protect the environment, our customers' experience, he said, trying to justify himself. But before he could finish, Eleanor held up her hand. You protected the surface, but not the heart of what this place should be. The word heart echoed strangely among the walls decorated with modern art. Because everyone there knew that the restaurant had lost its heart long ago. It had become nothing more than an expensive place with well-presented dishes. But what is a restaurant without a soul? Susan stepped forward, her eyes brimming with tears. I've been serving this salon since before it officially opened. I knew Mr. Thomas, and I'm ashamed I didn't recognize the look in his eyes in that boy. She looked at Peter. Forgive me, dear. I should have done something. Peter just nodded, still shy, still processing it all. It was the first time he'd heard so many adults apologizing to him. And it created a knot in his chest that was hard to explain. A feeling somewhere between justice and surprise. In the kitchen, Meredith turned off the stove and came into the living room. She took off her apron and walked over to Peter. When I was little, my mother used to say you should never deny a child food. But today, I was complicit in denying even a kind look. It makes me feel small. She took his hand. Mrs. Eleanor watched everything with a hard but hopeful expression. She knew that real change only comes when the truth is faced head-on. She didn't want to humiliate anyone. She wanted to open eyes. The problem wasn't the mistake. The problem was the indifference. And in that moment, many hearts were touched. Brad approached again. Ms. Eleanor, I understand if you want to fire me. But please, allow me to do something. I want to make amends. She looked him in the eye. Start with a hot dish. For our guest of honor. And then tell me what you really intend to do. The kitchen resumed operations. But this time, not with the same automaticity as before. There was purpose in the movements. Meredith prepared the dish as if she were cooking for a family member. The waiters moved more lightly, as if the moment had freed them from something invisible. Meanwhile, the customers watched in silence. Some discreetly dabbed their eyes with napkins. Others looked at Peter as if they finally saw him. Not as an intruder, but as someone who had brought back what the restaurant had lost: humanity. Susan brought a glass of warm milk and a homemade sweet roll. She placed it in front of Peter with a sincere smile. I made this morning. I've been waiting for the right person to serve it. He smiled for the first time. A small smile, but powerful. Because it was genuine. Eleanor sat at the table next to him, as if ready to listen, not to lecture. That gesture did more than any speech. Because when leaders stand with the little ones, the world begins to change. And in that moment, the heart of the restaurant began to beat again. In the back, near the powder room, a small wooden cross hung on the wall. No one else had noticed it. But in that moment, everyone saw it. It was as if God had made his presence felt there. As if to say, I'm still here. You just forgot to look for me. The dish arrived, steaming, fragrant, beautiful. But Peter looked at it as if it was something otherworldly. It was more than food. It was respect served on white china. He looked at Mrs. Eleanor and murmured, "Thank you." She squeezed his hand. "Thank God, dear. He brought you here today." Brad, his eyes red, turned to the customers and said, "Today, we serve more than meals. We serve humility. And whoever wants to learn, stay. Whoever wants to judge, leave." Some people applauded. Others just took a deep breath, absorbing every word. That afternoon, Eleanor's place wasn't just a place to eat. It was a silent temple of restoration. Every employee there was touched. Every customer was invited to reevaluate their values. And the most unlikely of all was the one responsible for it. A boy who came in dirty and left, blessed. But what no one knew yet was that the restaurant owner was on his way. And upon discovering what had happened there, the course of everything would change forever. The autumn winds continued to blow outside, but inside the restaurant the mood was different. The air was thick, almost sacred, as if everyone was waiting for something grand. Mrs. Eleanor sat at the table with Peter, like a matriarch returning to the throne. But in her eyes there was something beyond firmness. There were memories. Memories that still hurt. While he ate, she stared out the window, as if searching for an answer on the horizon. It was rare to see her in that state. She had always been known for her strength, her poise, her elegance. But there, in that moment, she seemed like nothing more than a grandmother trying to understand what God wanted to show her. And that vulnerability captivated everyone. She slowly removed her gloves, one at a time, with almost ceremonial gestures. The waiters watched her respectfully. The customers remained silent, as if watching this woman were more important than any meal. And for many it was. Something big was about to be revealed. But no one knew what. Peter, between spoonfuls, watched her curiously. He felt safe beside her. As if this moment were being written by an invisible hand, bigger than any human. Eleanor, for her part, lightly touched the brooch she wore. An antique, golden object with a delicate cross in the center. There was history there. In the private backroom, some of the restaurant's partners began to whisper. "What is she doing? Is she trying to expose us?" One of them asked. "She's the owner's mother, she can do whatever she wants," another replied. The tension was rising. But Eleanor didn't even look back. She knew exactly what she was doing. She took a deep breath and stood. She walked to the center of the room, gently tapping a spoon against a glass. The sound echoed delicately but firmly. Everyone stopped what they were doing. "I need to tell you some things," she began, her voice slightly choked but full of authority. "Things I've kept hidden for years." Susan's heart nearly stopped. She knew when Eleanor used that tone, something profound was coming. Peter held the napkin tightly, as if his soul knew it was part of the story, even if he couldn't understand how. And what Eleanor said next made everyone hold their breath. 30 years ago, my son nearly died in a fire." The sentence echoed through the room like a silent thunderclap. He was only 5 years old. And he would have died, if it weren't for a simple man. A gardener. His name was Thomas. Some faces lit up in recognition. Others were still confused. "Thomas pulled my son from the flames, but he lost his own life that day. I'll never forget the smell of the smoke, and the scream of pain from that child saving another." Her voice trailed off for a second. Meredith fought back tears. Susan crossed herself discreetly. And the customers stood still. I tried to help Thomas's family after that. But I discovered he had no living wife. Only a young son. She looked at Peter. And that son disappeared. No one knew where he went. To this day. The entire room turned its eyes to Peter. A murmur of surprise and tenderness ran through the room. Eleanor took a deep breath. When I looked into his eyes today, I saw Thomas. I saw the same look. The same quiet courage. And the same abandon. She lightly touched Peter's shoulder. I don't know how, but I know that this boy is part of that story. And I won't let him go through this alone. The partners were in shock. They didn't know whether to interrupt or let it happen. But no one had the courage to break that moment. Because, deep down, they knew she was right. That the restaurant needed a fresh start. And maybe it would start there. Eleanor sat back down, her eyes now brimming with tears. I didn't come here to cause a scene. I came to remember. To remember who we are. To remember the purpose of all this. She looked at each of them, as if touching the soul of each person present. And to remember that life always has a way of testing us again. Brad, now with a downcast expression, walked over to her. Mrs. Eleanor, this boy, if he really is Thomas's grandson, then he has a right to be here more than any of us. She nodded. We all have a right to be where there is compassion. That's what you need to understand. Across the restaurant, a younger woman named Claire stood up. My father was a firefighter. I remember the fire you mentioned. He talked about the brave man who didn't think twice. I didn't know he left a family behind. She approached Peter. I'm sorry, dear. Peter was paralyzed. Not because he didn't want to speak, but because, for the first time in a long time, words felt too heavy. His throat closed. His eyes were wet. His heart was trying to grasp that maybe God really was looking at him at that moment. Outside, a black car pulled up. It was discreet, but those who knew him knew. It was the restaurant owner's vehicle. Eleanor's son. Someone who never appeared in public, preferring to direct everything remotely. But that day, he felt he had to be present. And little did he know what awaited him. Susan noticed through the window and whispered to Meredith. He's here. Meredith nodded, worried. Will he approve of what's happening? And Susan replied, her eyes full of faith. If he has his father's heart, he'll do much more than approve. Eleanor, without looking back, murmured to herself, Now, Lord, it's up to him. Let him come with humility. She knew the next moment could be decisive. Because that boy there carried the same soul as the one who had once saved her only son's life. Peter sensed something was about to change again. The restaurant fell silent once more. The door opened. A tall man in a dark suit entered slowly. He had gray hair, a serious look, and a tired expression. But when he saw Eleanor, he stopped. And when he saw the boy, his expression changed completely. His eyes widened. As if he'd just seen a ghost. He took 2 steps forward, then stopped. Mom, what's going on here? Eleanor stood up unhurriedly. Something you needed to see for yourself. Then she pointed at Peter. Take a good look at him. The man knelt slowly before the boy. His gaze was fixed on that face. What's your name, boy? He asked hoarsely. Peter, he replied softly. The man brought his hand to his mouth. Peter. The same as my Savior's name. My father told me that name before he died. Eleanor sighed. Because this is his grandson. And with that revelation, the entire restaurant was gripped by an emotion no one expected. But the real twist was yet to come. The man knelt for long seconds, staring at the boy as if trying to retrieve something lost in time. The entire room held its breath. Each second felt like a year. Eleanor, motionless beside them, had her hands crossed over her chest, as if in silent prayer. And then, he spoke. Peter. She repeated, almost in a whisper. That was my best friend's name. Thomas's son. He disappeared right after the funeral. Eleanor nodded. He ran away. He was taken in by distant relatives, then abandoned. He grew up in foster homes, never knowing who he really was. The man stood slowly, still in shock. So, this boy is my godson? Eleanor gripped his arm firmly. He's more than that. He's part of the promise you never kept. Those words cut him like a knife. The silence around him was absolute. What promise? He asked, tears already in his eyes. Eleanor looked deep into her son's eyes. To care for the family of the man who saved your life. To never let Thomas's name be forgotten. To be grateful with actions, not words. And in that moment he understood. Too late. Peter watched everything silently, trying to piece together the puzzle. He knew there was something special there. But he still didn't understand why those people were looking at him that way. It was as if he possessed something precious. He didn't even know he possessed. Something called a legacy. The restaurant owner looked around. He saw the staff with their eyes downcast. The customers silent. The food growing cold on their plates. And all because of a boy he'd never seen. A boy who, by rights, should have grown up alongside him. Who should have been raised as part of the family. And that's when he broke down. He cried like a child, right there, in the center of the restaurant. Eleanor didn't try to stop him. Sometimes you have to break to rebuild. And there, amid sobs and regrets, the man who controlled an empire finally felt small. Human. Mom, why didn't you ever tell me? He asked, still kneeling. Eleanor answered firmly. Because you needed to see it with your own eyes. You needed to feel it. If I had told you before, you would have ignored it. But God has his own plans. And they always surprise us. Brad, the manager, swallowed hard. Sir, I kicked that boy out. I messed up. The restaurant owner stared at him. There was no anger. Only pain. It wasn't just you. We all made mistakes. 4 years. But today, we have a chance to change that. And it starts now. A new silence fell. A silence of decision. Peter. The man said, approaching. Would you like to spend the rest of the day with me? To see the place where your grandfather worked. Peter didn't answer right away. He looked at Eleanor, who just smiled and nodded. The boy smiled back. It was a yes. And in that smile, there was a new beginning. The partners began to emerge from the private rooms, their expressions confused. One of them approached Eleanor. Ma'am, this is going to become news. Shouldn't we settle this in private? She looked at him firmly. And why would we hide the truth? What was done here needs to be seen and felt. Cell phones started recording. Customers took photos. Some were already sharing the moment on social media. But no one seemed to be doing it out of vanity. It was as if everyone wanted to keep a piece of that miracle. Because that's what it felt like. A small miracle. In the middle of a restaurant. Meredith, her hands still covered in flour, murmured, I never thought I'd see anything like this in my life. Susan clutched the crucifix to her chest and replied, Sometimes God takes us to rock bottom, to show us the real heaven. The two looked at each other. They knew something had changed. In the kitchen, Ryan wept softly, hiding near the pantry. He was only 17, but that day he learned more about character than he had in his entire school. He mentally noted every gesture, every word. He knew that story would mark him forever. Because it wasn't just about Peter. It was about everyone. Peter held the restaurant owner's hand as he led him through the kitchen, the hallways, the places where his grandfather had worked. Every corner seemed to hold a secret. A story. A silent apology. And Peter listened to it all with attentive eyes. Absorbing every detail. This is where he saved my life, the man said, stopping in front of an old door. The fire started outside, but he ran in. Pulled me out the window. And he never came out. Peter touched the doorknob. My father was a hero, wasn't he? The man smiled. He was the greatest of them all. In the drawing room, Eleanor sat down again. She removed the brooch from her chest and placed it on the table. Susan approached. Are you really going to leave it here? Eleanor smiled. What God gives us, we must share. This brooch was given to me by Thomas's mother on the day of his funeral. Now it belongs to him. The circle was closed. But there was more to come. When the boy returned to the salon, accompanied by the owner, everyone applauded. A simple gesture, but full of meaning. It wasn't a prize. It was recognition. He was hugged by Susan, Meredith, Ryan, even Brad. And in each hug, he felt something he'd never known, belonging. Eleanor stood and said loudly, "This boy is not an intruder. He is part of the history of this place. Of the heart we almost lost. And which today begins to beat again." The people applauded again, this time standing. And amidst the applause and tears, something began to blossom there. A new purpose. But then, the reception phone rang. It was the mayor's assistant. He'd seen the video that was starting to circulate online. And he wanted to visit the restaurant in person that night. Something rare. And unexpected. Because this story was just beginning to touch hearts far beyond that room. The restaurant owner answered personally. "Yes, of course. It will be an honor to welcome you. But, may I ask why you're interested?" On the other end of the line, the answer came clearly. "Because what you did today is the story our city needs to hear. And perhaps, our country too." Peter, hearing this, became thoughtful. It was a lot to take in for one day. But there was a peace in his heart. A silent certainty that he was no longer alone. That this place, once filled with rejection, now bore his mark. Not that of pain, but that of redemption. And just when everyone thought that was the end of the story, Eleanor smiled and said softly, "There's still the most important part." Susan, confused, asked, "What, ma'am?" She looked at Peter and said, "The gift his grandfather left, that no one ever knew about." And so, the next chapter opened. Susan looked at Eleanor as if gazing at a prophecy. The woman had always carried dignity, but now she seemed shrouded in mystery. "What gift is this, ma'am?" she asked, almost in a whisper. Eleanor took a moment to answer. Her eyes roamed the room, stopping on each employee's face. It was as if each look told her a part of the story. "Many years ago, Thomas gave me a box," she began, her voice low and firm. "He said it was to be opened only when his name was remembered with honor again." Everyone looked at each other, confused. "I kept this box in my personal safe. I've never touched it. But today, the time has come." She asked Ryan to go to the car and get the small black briefcase. Inside was the key to the antique safe, kept in her home for over 3 decades. As the boy ran, the atmosphere in the restaurant changed. The customers now waited with the same nervous anticipation as those watching the end of a movie. But this was real. While they waited, the restaurant owner approached her mother and asked softly, "Why didn't you ever tell me about this box?" Eleanor took his hand. "Because you wouldn't have understood yet. Only when you felt the weight of the story on your own shoulders would you know how to carry it with respect." He simply nodded, moved. Peter sat beside Mrs. Eleanor. She ran her fingers tenderly through his hair. "You have your grandfather's eyes. But there's something more. Something even he didn't know he'd left behind." Peter didn't understand everything yet, but he felt something big enveloping him. And for the first time, it didn't scare him. Ryan returned with the key. Eleanor held it carefully, as if it were made of glass. "We'll need to go to my house. What's stored there shouldn't be opened here." The restaurant owner, without hesitation, said, "Everyone goes." And within minutes, employees, customers, and even curious onlookers made their way to the matriarch's residence. Eleanor's house was one of those southern mansions, with white columns, wide windows, and immaculate gardens. But now, more than beauty, it carried expectation. Upon entering, everyone was led to a small, simple room where an antique safe was built into the wall. Eleanor opened it slowly. The sound of the rusty latch seemed to echo in the souls of everyone there. Inside the safe was a dark wooden box, weathered by time. Eleanor took it out with both hands and placed it on the table. "Thomas told me this was the greatest treasure of his life," she whispered, "and that I would only understand one day." She slowly opened the lid. Inside were letters, photos, a sealed envelope, and a small leather-bound notebook. Susan clapped her hands over her mouth. Meredith began to cry. And Peter just stared in silence, as if every page in the box carried the sound of his grandfather's heartbeat anew. Eleanor picked up the notebook first. She opened it to the first page. There was a dedication. To Peter. "When you grow up, I hope you read this and know who you are. Love, Dad." The silence was broken by a collective sigh. Those words came from a lost time, but now, they came back alive. The restaurant owner knelt before the box. He picked up the sealed envelope and recognized the seal. It was from the town clerk's office. "This is official," he said, his voice breaking. He opened it carefully. Inside was a will. Thomas had left everything he owned to his son, Peter. Land, savings, and an unfinished project. "What's this?" Peter asked. Eleanor replied, "Your grandfather's dream was to open a restaurant. Not for the rich, but for those who couldn't afford it. A place where no one would be turned away. Where everyone would eat with dignity." Peter's eyes filled with tears. It was as if he could hear his grandfather's voice speaking to him. "But why was it forgotten?" Susan asked. The owner replied, his gaze fixed on the ground. "Because no one wanted to give up comfort to fulfill such an inconvenient dream." Eleanor nodded. "And because there was no one who had the courage to continue. Until today." The letters were addressed to Peter. Some told simple stories. Others contained prayers. There was one that said, "Never forget that you bear the name of Peter, the Apostle. Rock. Foundation. God will use your pain to build something beautiful." And that touched everyone there deeply. Peter held the notebook with trembling hands. He could barely read, but every word seemed written for him. Eleanor, seeing this, said, "We're going to open this restaurant. We're going to make Thomas's dream come true. But it will have a different name. A name everyone will recognize." She looked at Peter. "Yours." The new project would begin there that night. The restaurant would be called Pedro's Table. A table for everyone. No distinction. No expulsions. A place where food would nourish the body and love the soul. Customers and staff exchanged glances. No one wanted to be left out of this story. The mayor, upon arriving and hearing everything, made an unexpected speech. "This city needs this. It needs to remember what really matters. And this boy with his story showed us what we've forgotten." And he announced, the city would help make the new community restaurant possible. The entire city applauded. But what no one knew was that there was one more letter. One Eleanor had kept to herself. Addressed to her. Handwritten. From Thomas. And in that letter was a confession that would change the course of history. She tucked it away in her pocket, determined to read it at the right moment. And that moment was near. Peter spent the night at Eleanor's house. He slept for the first time in a warm room, with clean sheets and a blanket that smelled of lavender. Before falling asleep, he glanced at his grandfather's notebook on the nightstand. He murmured, "I'll keep going, Grandpa. I promise." And he fell asleep with a hopeful smile. Meanwhile, Eleanor sat alone on the porch. She took the letter from her pocket. She opened it carefully. She read it in silence. And then, she cried. She cried like she had never cried before. Because in that letter, Thomas revealed something no one could have imagined. Something that could change even the way she saw her own son. But she wouldn't tell. Not yet. Because certain truths should only be spoken when the heart is ready. And hers needed one more night. One more silence. One more encounter with God. So she put the letter back in the safe. And let the world sleep in peace. And on that calm dawn, a shooting star streaked across the Charleston sky. Like a sign. Like a promise. What began as a rejection was becoming a legacy. But the true climax was yet to come. The next morning, the sun gently streamed through Peter's bedroom window. It was as if even the sky knew that this day would be unusual. He woke slowly, looked at the white ceiling, then at his grandfather's notebook, still lying there beside him. He sat up in bed and, for a moment, couldn't believe it was all real. But it was. Life had changed. In the kitchen, Eleanor prepared breakfast with her own hands, a rarity for a woman who had always had servants. But that day, she felt the need to put her heart into every gesture. As she stirred the hot chocolate, her eyes returned to the hidden letter. Thomas's confession. The story that had never been told. She sat alone at the porch table, the envelope open in her hands. The paper was already yellowing, the handwriting shaky but clear. Thomas began the letter with a direct sentence. If you are reading this, it is because the day has come when the truth must be born. Eleanor felt her heart race. She knew there would be no turning back from that moment. I told you about the fire. But what I didn't tell you is that it wasn't an accident. Those words stopped the world for a moment. Eleanor put her hand to her mouth. A shiver ran through her. How could it not have been an accident? She read it again. It read, without a doubt, the house was set on fire. On purpose. Someone wanted to take your son out of the picture. And I found out who it was, too late. Eleanor stood up, trembling. She paced the porch with the letter in her hands. She was in shock. The fire that nearly took her son's life hadn't been a coincidence. There was an enemy. Someone who had tried to destroy her family. He was your husband's business partner. A greedy man. He wanted to take over the restaurant and ruin your family name. He threatened me. But by the time I realized he was going to burn the house down, it was too late. Eleanor felt a sudden nausea. This changed everything. Even the way she remembered her husband. Peter stepped onto the porch barefoot. He saw Eleanor sitting there, pale, her eyes distant. Are you okay, Mrs. Eleanor? He asked softly. She smiled, but it was a smile tinged with sadness. Yes, dear. Just reminiscing. He leaned closer, curious. Was it my grandfather's? She nodded. Yes, it was. She tucked the letter into her pocket, determined not to reveal it yet. But the story needed to be told. And she began to tell it, as best she could. She sat with Peter and told him about the day of the fire, about Thomas's courage, about how he gave his life for someone he didn't even know that well. Peter listened silently. Your grandfather was an extraordinary man, she said, her voice breaking. And he died the way heroes die, saving. Peter then asked, why has no one ever talked about him? Eleanor sighed deeply. Because sometimes people are ashamed of being saved. The sentence hung in the air, heavy and true. Meanwhile, back home, newspapers were starting to pick up the story. The restaurant video was already on 4 million views. Headlines like "Expelled Boy is Grandson of Anonymous Hero" spread. People came from other states just to visit the place. Something different was happening there. Something divine. At City Hall, the mayor met with council members to officially endorse the new community restaurant project. This will mark our city forever, he said. We're going to name the Central Square after Thomas. It was the least he could do. His memory could no longer be ignored. And while everyone mobilized, Eleanor still carried the weight of the letter on her chest. She knew she couldn't keep that secret forever. But she also knew that if she revealed everything now, it could cause irreparable damage. The man who set the house on fire was still alive. And he was influential. She went to the local church, A simple chapel with wooden pews and colored windows. She sat alone and prayed. She wept. She asked God for discernment. Lord, if it's time to reveal myself, give me courage. But if it's not yet, show me the path of silence with wisdom. And in that moment, she felt peace. Susan entered the chapel and approached cautiously. Is everything okay, ma'am? She asked gently. Eleanor looked into her eyes. I've discovered something terrible. Something that could hurt a lot of people. Susan took her hand. Then give it to God, and He will show you the right time to act. Eleanor simply nodded. At the end of that day, the restaurant owner invited everyone to an open house. He wanted to officially introduce Peter as part of the founding family. The room was packed. Cameras, journalists, neighbors. And when Peter took the makeshift stage, there wasn't a dry eye in the place. He said few words. I don't know much, but I know my grandfather was brave. And I'll try to be like him, even if I make mistakes. I just want no one else to be kicked out for being hungry. The applause lasted for minutes. Eleanor wept silently. That was worth everything. But then an elderly woman approached the stage. No one recognized her immediately. She introduced herself as Margaret, former secretary to Eleanor's husband's former business partner. And what she said next froze the room. I know who set that house on fire. I saw it. And I kept that secret for decades. The restaurant owner was shocked. Eleanor slowly stood up. Margaret continued. I saw him light the torch. I saw the checks. And I kept quiet. But now, seeing this boy, I can't keep it to myself anymore. And she handed him a folder of documents. Evidence. Signatures. Dates. Everything. The truth Thomas had tried to warn was now exposed. And with it, justice would come. But also pain. Because the man behind it all was a household name. A town philanthropist. A friend to all. And now, his mask would fall. Eleanor knew there would be no going back. But she felt it was right. She held up the documents and said aloud, the truth doesn't belong to us. It belongs to God. And when the time is right, it rises. Even if it hurts. Even if it changes everything. Peter looked at her with admiration. This woman was more than a protector. She was a warrior for the truth. The entire town watched the downfall of the man who tried to snuff out a life. But what he actually achieved was to light a flame that would never be extinguished. And just when everything seemed to have been revealed, Eleanor invited Peter for a walk. Alone. Because the final secret had yet to be told. They walked through his grandfather's old land, now cleared and prepared for the new restaurant. Eleanor stopped near a huge tree and said, this is where it all began. And this is where it will all begin again. Peter smiled. But she wasn't finished yet. There's something I need to tell you. Something that's at the bottom of the letter. Peter looked at her curiously. And she took a deep breath. Your grandfather didn't just save my son. He saved me too. But that is a story no one knows. And there, between the lines, the next chapter opened. Because the story isn't over yet. They stood beneath the tree, the golden leaves falling gently, as if the sky were celebrating the moment. Peter kicked pebbles absently, while Eleanor gazed at the horizon. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was thick, heavy, and it was about to be shattered by a truth that would change everything. Eleanor held the boy's hand. She could feel the thin skin, the small but firm fingers. She took a deep breath and said, Peter, you know your grandfather saved my son. But what I never told you is that he also saved me. Peter's eyes widened. What do you mean? She smiled sadly. Saved my heart. She sat down at the root of the tree and pulled a small envelope from her pocket. This envelope was hidden inside the letter. And in it, There's a revelation I myself found hard to believe. Peter, confused, sat down beside her. Eleanor then said something that made him freeze. Thomas was more than a hero to me. He was my love. The world stopped in that instant. The wind stilled. The birds fell silent. And Peter stared at her unblinkingly. Your love. Eleanor nodded. Yes, Peter. When my husband was away, when my soul was lost in silence, it was Thomas who listened to me, who prayed with me, who wiped my tears. But Peter tried to understand. And your son? Eleanor looked him deep in the eyes. My son was saved by Thomas. But he was also part of Thomas. The boy frowned, trying to understand. And then she said what no one would ever have expected to hear. Peter, your grandfather, was my son's father. He was his father. Peter fell to his knees, breathless. But does that mean? Eleanor nodded, her eyes brimming with tears. Yes, Peter. You and my son are blood brothers. You are part of this family. Not out of gratitude, but by right. The revelation washed over me like a storm of love and pain at the same time. She hugged Peter tightly. You're not just the hero's grandson. You're my grandson too. Peter began to cry softly. It was so much emotion. But there, between the sobs, was an inexplicable peace. Because now everything made sense. He was never completely abandoned. Just forgotten by a story that remained hidden. At the restaurant, the owner still didn't know anything. He was meeting with architects and staff, organizing the details of the new project. But he felt something strange in his heart, as if an important piece of the story was still missing. And he was right. Because the biggest piece was about to arrive. Peter and Eleanor returned together, hand in hand, different, connected. And when they reached the salon, everyone noticed. There was something new in that look. Something old, and at the same time, newly discovered. The owner approached. Is everything okay? Eleanor looked at him and said, Son, we need to talk. Now. They went to the office. Inside, Eleanor locked the door and handed him the envelope. Read it. He opened it with trembling hands. His eyes scanned every line. And then, his legs gave out. He sat slowly in the chair. That can't be true. Eleanor came closer and took his hand. But it is. Thomas was my father, he asked, unable to hold back his tears. Yes, Eleanor replied. And I never told you because I thought it would protect you. But today, seeing this boy, seeing his courage, I realized that the truth sets you free. Even if it hurts. Even if it tears us down first. He was silent for a long time. Then he stood and looked in the mirror. He touched his face as if trying to recognize the features of the man he had only known as a gardener. My God, he was always so close. And I never knew. Eleanor leaned closer. You knew, in here. You always knew. Peter was called in. The man looked at him differently now. No longer as a needy child, but as part of him. Part of his blood, his history, his name. Come here, Peter, he said, kneeling. I didn't know. But now that I know, I'll never leave you alone again. And the embrace between them healed generations. Outside, the staff watched everything without understanding the details. But they knew something sacred had happened inside. Susan said through tears, I don't know what it was, but I felt God in there. Meredith nodded. God. And Thomas. He still lives. In every gesture, in every revelation. The news spread quickly. But Eleanor made a request. We don't want scandal. We want restoration. And so it was. The story didn't make the newspapers. But it spread in hearts. And somehow, each person who knew became the guardian of a beautiful secret. A secret that united, not separated. Peter became known as Little Thomas among his closest friends. He grew, day by day, into a symbol of a new era. An era of truth, justice, and love that conquers time and lies. The restaurant was almost ready. And now, it would have two legitimate owners, father and son, brothers, united by their grandfather. At the opening of Pedro's table, Eleanor gave a brief but powerful speech. When we deny a plate of food, we deny more than sustenance. We deny humanity. But when we reach out, we feed even forgotten souls. May this table never be closed to anyone again. Peter was the first to serve a dish. It was vegetable soup. Simple, warm, fragrant, served with a smile. This soup is my grandfather's recipe, he said. And the customers were moved. Because it wasn't just soup. It was liquid memory. It was love served in spoons. But at the end of the party, Eleanor called Peter back for a walk. There's more, my dear. The last piece of the story. The one your grandfather never wanted anyone to know. But the one you deserve to hear. And so, at the foot of that same tree, she opened her heart one last time. Thomas was a simple man. But there was a reason he was in our house, even if he was just a gardener. Peter looked at her curiously. Eleanor continued. He was sent by your great-grandfather. Because he was his illegitimate son. Thomas was family. But he had been hidden, silenced, erased. Peter couldn't speak. His blood had always been intertwined with that place. He was never a stranger. He was a living legacy of a suppressed history. Eleanor hugged him. You are God's chance to make things right. And your mission is to keep that truth alive, with humility and love. The restaurant became a national symbol. It won awards, recognition, and support from NGOs. But above all, it became a place where love was served. Where no one was expelled anymore. Where the name Thomas was sacred. And where Peter grew up as the boy who turned pain into destiny. But fate had one more test in store. Something none of them expected. Something that would put this entire story to the test. Because sometimes, the past comes back again. And when it does, it can come back with more force than before. Pedro's table had become the heart of the city. Every day, lines formed before the doors even opened. Simple folks, entire families, lonely seniors, veterans, single mothers. Everyone was greeted with the same smile. No one asked how much they had in their pockets. Just whether they were hungry. And that was enough. Peter would arrive early, put on his apron, and greet each one by name. He'd already memorized their faces, their habits, even their stories. He was only 10 years old, but he was treated as if he were 50. With respect. With affection. He was no longer just the gardener's grandson. He was the symbol of an everyday miracle. Eleanor watched him from a distance with a heart full of gratitude. She knew Pedro's table was more than a restaurant. It was an altar. A place where God visited people in silence, between a spoonful of soup and an unexpected hug. And that day, especially, she felt something different was about to happen. It was an ordinary Tuesday when a woman in a beige dress walked in. Her hair was tied back, her eyes were weary, and she held a small boy by the hand. No one recognized her immediately. But there was something about the way she walked that put the room on edge. As if she carried a secret hidden beneath her skin. Peter walked over to her with his usual smile. Hello, welcome. I'm so glad you came. The woman looked at him for a few seconds and asked, Are you the Peter from the TV? The boy laughed. It depends. If it's the one from the restaurant, it's me. She didn't smile. She just nodded. And murmured, So, that's why I came. Eleanor noticed the strange atmosphere. She watched from afar, but something about the woman bothered her. Susan, who was organizing the tables, felt the same. There was tension in the air. The woman asked to speak to the owner. When she learned he was traveling, She asked to speak to Eleanor. "I have something important to tell you." Mrs. Eleanor welcomed her into the back room. Just the two of them. The woman took a deep breath and said, "My name is Rachel. And this boy," pointing to her son, "is the son of one of the restaurant's long-time partners." Eleanor nodded, still not understanding the connection. And Rachel dropped the bombshell. "He's the grandson of the man who ordered your house burned down." The world stopped again. Eleanor felt her legs weaken, but she stood firm. Rachel continued, "I know what my son's father did. And I know he never paid for it. He died without facing justice. But I don't want to continue this cycle. I came to ask for forgiveness. For his blood. For his cowardice." Susan entered slowly, having overheard part of the conversation. She nearly fell to her knees when she heard it. Eleanor stood up and walked to the window. "You're not to blame for what he did," she said calmly. "But carrying that blood, it must hurt." Rachel nodded, tears in her eyes. "It hurts. Especially since he never repented." Eleanor turned to her. "Your son, has he eaten today?" Rachel shook her head. "Then let's start there. Here, no one needs to pay for the sins of the father. They just need to be hungry." Rachel burst into tears. This woman, the most wounded in the city, was offering mercy. Peter watched in confusion. But when he saw Rachel leave the room, crying and smiling at the same time, he knew something big had happened. He served the boy, a little boy named Ben, a plate. And as he set the food on the table, he said, "Here, you can eat as much as you want. No one's going to turn you away." Rachel told Eleanor the whole story. About how Ben's father tried to deny his past. How violent he was. How he hid documents. How he threatened anyone who learned the truth. But now he was dead. And she wanted to free her son from the curse of his family name. Then Eleanor proposed something unexpected. He called everyone into the room. Employees, customers, even neighbors. He asked for silence. And then he publicly explained what had just happened. "This woman here, Rachel, came to ask us for forgiveness for what her son's father did. And I want everyone to hear this with a clear heart." The silence was total. When she came in here, she carried not only a child, but a weight. The weight of shame, guilt, and doubt. And today, that weight falls to the ground. She looked at Rachel and said, "The past has been forgiven. And the door to our hearts remains open." Everyone applauded. Some even cried. But then, a man in a suit stood up in the background. No one knew him. He introduced himself Aslawire for the former partner's family, and said loudly, "You can't use that name in the restaurant. It's registered. We're going to sue." The room froze. The mood changed in seconds. Peter took a step forward. Startled, but determined. "The name is mine. It's the name my grandfather left. And if you want to sue someone, sue me." Eleanor stood. "And me too." The restaurant owner, who had just returned, added, "And me. Because the name isn't a logo. It's a legacy." The city mobilized. A petition was created. In 2 days, more than 50,000 signatures. The pressure was so great that the case was dropped. The truth was greater than any document. And the name, Pedro's Table, became a symbol of resistance. Of redemption. The following Sunday, the local pastor held a special service inside the restaurant. He read Psalm 23 aloud. He said, "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will not fear. For there is a table prepared. And that table is for everyone." The entire room responded with, "Amen." Rachel was hired to work there. Ben started helping in the kitchen, learning from Peter. 2 boys who might once have been enemies were now brothers for life. They grew up side by side, sharing tasks, playing, serving, and proving that forgiveness changes destinies. Eleanor smiled as she watched them run down the hallway. She knew the past hadn't been erased, but it had been transformed, and that each day there would be a new opportunity to teach the world that love, when real, transcends even the worst inheritances. But while everyone was celebrating, an envelope arrived in the mail. No return address. Sealed with red wax. Addressed to Peter. Inside, a single handwritten sentence. You need to know who else Thomas saved before he died. And so, another mystery was revealed. Peter held the envelope as if it were dynamite. The handwriting was unlike anything she'd ever seen. Elegant. Precise. Almost ancient. Eleanor leaned closer, curious. Where did this come from? Peter shook his head. I don't know. It was on the doorstep. No one saw who left it. She frowned. She knew something serious was coming. They opened it together. Inside, just one sheet. One sentence. Written in black ink. You need to know who else Thomas saved before he died. Eleanor felt her stomach churn. It wasn't just a sentence. It was a call. An echo from the past. We need to find out who sent this, she said. Susan suggested searching the hospital's old records. Maybe someone involved in that fire is still alive. The restaurant owner agreed. Let's dig through everything. If Thomas saved anyone else, we need to find them. And so, a new investigation began. This time, not for justice, but for honor. Meredith called a former firefighter who had worked the fire. He was elderly, living in a nursing home, but he still remembered the details as if it were yesterday. There was a woman, he said. Pregnant. She was unconscious when Thomas came in. He pulled her out through the back door. They disappeared into the smoke. Did she survive? Susan asked. The firefighter nodded. Yes. Taken to the hospital. But I never heard from her again. Her face was burned. She said she didn't want to see anyone. She changed her name. Eleanor fell silent. Something about the description sounded familiar. Very familiar. Peter, curious as ever, wanted to join the search. He started going to the town library with Ryan, the assistant. They combed through old newspapers, public records, and any clues about the pregnant woman. Until they found a footnote, patient identified as M.A., survivor of the Charleston fire, transferred confidentially. M.A. Eleanor frowned. Margaret Andrews. Susan's eyes widened. Ms. Margaret. The one who brought the partner's documents. Eleanor nodded. Everything was starting to fall into place. Maybe she knew more than she'd revealed. Much more. They invited Margaret to tea. She arrived, elegant as ever. She sat at the table, but when she saw the envelope, she paled. You found. She murmured. Eleanor was direct. The pregnant woman. Was that you? Margaret took a deep breath. Tears came before she could speak. And then, she told him. Yes. I was there. Pregnant. Afraid. My husband had threatened to kill me if I revealed his crimes. I tried to run, but the fire surrounded me. Her voice trembled. Thomas found me. He carried me in his arms. He carried me out. He saved me. And my baby. Peter was paralyzed. Your baby. Margaret nodded. He was born a few days later, but he was taken by a family from another town. I couldn't stay. I had to disappear. I never saw him again. Silence fell. And the question hung in the air. Where was that son? Meredith suggested looking up hospital adoption records from that time period. Eleanor made contact. And within days, they discovered the baby had been adopted by a family named Matthews. He was raised under the name Daniel. He currently lived in Asheville, North Carolina. And she had no idea where he came from. Peter insisted. I want to meet him. Eleanor was cautious. We don't know how he'll react. But Peter didn't give in. If he's the son of someone my grandfather saved, he's part of this too. And with everyone's support, they arranged a meeting. A trip that would change everything once again. Daniel Matthews was 29 years old. He was a nurse. Single. Shy. When he got the call, he thought it was a prank. But something in Eleanor's voice convinced him. And the following week, he arrived at the restaurant. He looked around curiously, unaware that his life was about to be turned upside down. When Margaret saw him, she cried, "My son." Daniel froze. "I'm sorry." "What?" Peter explained everything. Little by little. Carefully. He talked about Thomas. The fire. The letter. The rescue. Daniel listened in silence, without saying a word. And finally he asked, "Why did you tell me all this?" Eleanor stood. "Because truth is a gift, not a burden. Because you deserve to know who you are." Margaret stepped closer. "I never stopped loving you. Never. But I had to hide you to save you." Daniel wept. And in that embrace between mother and son, a new story began to unfold. But Daniel had something to say too. "I work in a hospital where many patients don't have families. I've always dreamed of opening a group home for them." Peter smiled. "My grandfather dreamed of something similar." And in that instant, the two projects came together. Pedro's desk would now also have shelter. The restaurant gained an extension next door, a respite space for people undergoing treatment, without homes or support. Daniel took over this wing. Peter, the kitchen. Margaret, the letter library. And Eleanor, the soul of it all. The miracle grew, branched out, like a tree that never stops blossoming. But every blessing also attracts resistance. Haters began attacking the project on social media. They called it emotional exposure, media charity, a pious restaurant. Peter was saddened. Eleanor gathered everyone together and said, "Truth is like light. Those who live in darkness will always try to extinguish it." Even so, the project's momentum grew. Neighboring towns wanted to open their own Pedro's tables. NGOs sought support. Even universities wanted to study the model. Peter just wanted to remain a boy. But he knew he was more than that now. He was the guardian of a legacy. And he was ready. On Thomas's birthday, they held a special celebration. They showed a video of old footage. His voice, recorded on an old cassette, said, "If one day my name is remembered, let it be for something good. For something that nourishes." No one held back their tears. Because he went far beyond that. Peter sat near the tree in the backyard, with Daniel beside him. "Do you think Grandpa Thomas knew all this?" he asked. Daniel smiled. "I think he did. Because when you plant with faith, you reap beyond your wildest dreams." And together, they sat in silence. Feeling. Living. Believing. But that night, a phone call shattered the peace. It was from the city attorney. "We've received a federal subpoena. Someone is trying to block the project's expansion. They're alleging political misuse of Thomas's image." Eleanor closed her eyes. She knew another battle was beginning. And that it wouldn't be easy. The summons phone call fell like a silent bomb. Eleanor hung up without saying a word. She walked to the backyard and sat alone. The moon was full, white as the linen of the restaurant tablecloths. Susan approached, concerned. "What happened?" Eleanor replied with a sentence no one expected. "They're going to try to erase Thomas again." The next morning, the news was all over the newspapers. An influential group had filed a lawsuit against the Pedro's Table project, alleging misuse of collective emotional assets and sentimental exploitation for influence. The city was in shock. The restaurant, silent. Peter didn't understand all the legalese, but he understood the tone. And even more, he understood the fear in Eleanor's eyes. "Are they going to shut us down?" She took a deep breath. "They'll try." But his answer was simple, firm. Then we'll fight. Like Grandpa would. And with that, he rekindled the fire. The community mobilized like never before. Ordinary people recorded videos. Former clients shared stories. Children drew pictures with phrases like, "Here I was happy. Here I ate when no one else wanted to see me." The movement went viral. Within a week, the case became a national scandal. Talk shows began inviting Peter and Eleanor. But she refused all interviews. It's not about fame. It's about faith. She preferred to continue serving soup, praying silently, speaking out only when necessary. But the pressure was so great that the courts had to listen to the people. The trial was scheduled in Washington. Something unprecedented for a community restaurant. The entire city offered its support. Peter, in a suit and tie, traveled with Eleanor, Daniel, and Susan. As they entered the courtroom, reporters shouted questions. But they entered in silence, as if carrying something sacred. The judge was rigid. The arguments against the project were cold and technical. But when it came time for the defense, Eleanor stood. The room fell silent. She began with a verse. "I was hungry, and you gave me food." Then she looked the judge in the eye and said, "They want to erase a table. But they'll have to brave heaven to do it." Peter spoke too. His voice low but firm. "I just wanted food. I was kicked out. Then they gave me love. I grew up. Now I give love too. If that's a crime, then I'm guilty." Some people cried. Others tried to contain their emotions. But everyone knew that child carried the truth in his eyes. Margaret also spoke. She told how Thomas had saved her. How she lost a son. How she found him again. Her voice trembled, but her faith didn't. "This project saved me. From myself. And if it's shut down, it's because the world has given up on love." The silence was profound. The judge called a recess. He needed to think. Outside, a crowd had gathered. They held candles. They sang hymns. Some held signs with slogans like, "Peter's table is God's table," and "Food, love, justice." It was more than a protest. It was a cry. A spiritual, emotional, almost celestial manifestation. At the end of the day, the judge returned. Everyone sat down. He cleared his throat, read the documents, and said, "There are laws that defend names, brands, and properties. But there are also principles that defend the human spirit. And this project is an altar to hope." And then he declared, "The process is closed. Project authorized to continue." The hall erupted in applause. Peter hugged Eleanor tightly. Susan wept, hugging Margaret. Daniel let out a sigh that felt like it held years. And amidst the joy, Peter stood on the stool and said loudly, "The table will remain open. Forever." And there, in that moment, history was made forever. Back in town, they were welcomed as heroes. But they refused any tribute. They simply asked that anyone who was hungry know where to find a chair. And so, the restaurant continued to operate. With more love. More stories. More faith. Because now, it was impossible to stop. On Eleanor's birthday, everyone prepared a surprise. Peter gave her a new wooden plaque with her full name on it, "Peter's Table," in honor of Thomas, the gardener who planted eternity with a gesture. Eleanor cried like a child. She never thought she would live to see it. A year later, more than 100 community restaurants with the same name had opened across the U.S. Inspired by Peter, by Thomas, by Eleanor, by faith, and by a boy who was expelled, but returned to change everything. But life still holds secrets. In Eleanor's attic, while sorting through old boxes, Peter found something no one expected. An envelope with a blue ribbon. Inside, a photo of Thomas, holding a baby. On the back, a handwritten sentence. "For the son who will one day recognize me." It was Peter. A baby. In his grandfather's arms. The photo had been taken by Eleanor. And when he saw it, Peter cried. He knew me. He held me. Eleanor nodded, overcome with emotion. Yes. And he blessed you, Peter. From day one. And that was more than enough. Peter's story was adapted into a film, with the family's permission. But no Hollywood scene captures what really happened in that restaurant. Because there, what was served, was more than food. It was redemption. It was a miracle. It was love embodied in every gesture. And to this day, if you pass through the city, you'll see the restaurant with its simple facade, flowers in the window, and a wooden sign with words in gold letters. Inside, people of all kinds sit side by side, sharing silence, soup, and hope. And if you're lucky, Peter might be there, all grown up, but with the same sweet gaze. He can serve you. He can listen to you. He can show you that the world still has a chance. Because as long as there's an open table, there's a chance for a new beginning. And in every bite, in every cup, in every simple conversation, there will be the spirit of Thomas, of the gardener who planted much more than flowers. He planted faith. He planted forgiveness. He planted the future. Have you ever wondered how many extraordinary stories lie hidden behind a simple gesture of rejection? How many people, like Peter, pass us by every day, hungry for food, for love, for a look that says, "You matter"? What if the person you judged yesterday is exactly who God chose to teach you today? How many times have we said no with our eyes, without even realizing it? What if someone's second chance depends on your courage to love first? This story reminds us that miracles don't fall from the sky with trumpets and lights. They walk through the front door, dirty, shy, waiting only for a plate, and a little compassion. How many miracles have you missed? The truth is, we all have a little bit of Peter inside us. And a little bit of Eleanor, too. The challenge is deciding which part of us we'll nurture each day. The part of fear, or the part of faith. And now, I want to hear from you. Have you ever felt rejected for something you couldn't control? Have you ever reached out to someone the world would rather forget? What would you do if you had the chance to change a life, with just one gesture? Leave your answer in the comments. Let's talk. Let's build a space together where our stories inspire other women, because the world needs your voice. I take this opportunity to ask you with great affection that like this video, subscribe to the channel and activate notifications. This helps us continue to bring you stories that nourish, heal, and transform. Stories that touch the heart like this one. And never forget, as long as there is an open table, there is hope. As long as there is faith, there will be a new beginning. God bless you with love, health, wisdom, and strength. You are precious, and the world needs you. See you in the next story.